Have you ever felt so humiliated that you thought, no one will ever remember me? Charles Dickens too, and when everything seemed lost, something he never expected happened. In this video, you will find out the unbelievable turn in Dickens's life, and how this proves that even the biggest failure can hide a fresh start. If this story already touches you, write, "I believe in restarts," and subscribe to the channel to continue receiving messages that strengthen the soul. When Charles Dickens was only 12 years old, while other boys learned to read or ran the streets, he discovered what hell it was, not in metaphors, but on cold walls, dirty grease pots, and endless journeys that started before sunrise and only ended when night had no more stars. His work was simple and brutal, labels in grease pots in a damp and dark factory for 10 hours every day. The nauseating smell impregnated your skin. The tiredness accumulated in the fragile bones of those who had not yet completed childhood. Humiliation was daily, so common that it became routine. No one seemed to notice that thin boy, torn clothes and eyes that already carried a weight greater than his age. It was as if he had been forgotten by all, by family, society, God. The laughs of his schoolmates echoed as a distant, almost cruel memory. He knew he didn't have time for dreams. His reality was to survive another day without fainting with hunger or fear, and every clock of the clock seemed to mock what was stolen. In that hostile environment, Dickens learned what it meant to be invisible. There was born the feeling that would later shape their stories. The pain of those who are not seen, the loneliness of those who are ignored, the revolt of who knows that the world could be different, but chooses not to be. The factory was not just work. It was prison. It was a cruel reminder that for many, childhood ends before it even started. And yet, even immersed in that hell, something was formed inside. A spark, a silent voice that said that it could not be everything. That perhaps, in some corner of the future, there was a place where he could be heard, where his pain would not be in vain. But at that moment, hope was just a whisper, almost imperceptible, because for Dickens, the factory was its first contact with abandonment. Your first meeting with injustice, your first hell, and this experience never left it. Not even when it became famous. Not when everyone applauded him. The memory of the factory, dirty ground, tiredness and fear accompanied every word he wrote and made him not only a writer, but the voice of those the world insists on forgetting. When Charles Dickens' father was arrested for debt, a cruel sentence that crushed whole families in Victorian England, the boy's life, who was already difficult, became a silent tragedy. It was not enough to work out stairs at the factory. The deepest blow also came, the feeling of being abandoned by those who should protect him most. Her mother, instead of fighting to gather her family, remained with her husband in prison and left Dickens handed over to her own luck in a dark room of a cheap pension. The boy, who already carried physical exhaustion, now also carried the emotional burden of abandonment. For months he woke up and slept alone. Solitude echoed in the damp walls. Each ranger on the floor remembered that no one would come. He cried softly, fearing being heard by the strangers of the big house where he was dropped. He spent hours looking out the window, waiting for a well-known face that never appeared. I begged in thoughts for a visit, any sign that it still mattered to someone, but the silence responded. And with each passing day, that child felt more invisible, more disposable, more convinced that it was just one of so many boys than the system and families considered inconvenient. The worst was not hunger, nor the fear of the dark. It was the feeling of being forgotten, to have no value even for the mother herself. Confidence for him is no longer natural. From there he learned that love can be fragile, that affection can be conditioned, that people can leave even when you need them most. It was in this pension room, smelling of mold and poorly rye tears, that Dickens knew the deepest pain, the pain of having nowhere to go back. This wound never healed, and in a way, she shaped the writer he would become. Because those who were left behind understand the pain of the invisible like no one else. Each orphan of his stories carries a little of this abandoned boy. Each humiliated child brings echoes of the cry that no one heard. Each injustice narrated by its penalty is also an attempt to prevent the world from continuing to normalize the abandonment of the little ones. Dickens was not just a boy alone. It was one survivor who turned trauma into a compass for himself and for generations that would come later. But in that cold room, he didn't know that yet. I just knew it was alone. And that, to the world, He was just another disposable child. The boy who worked at the factory and was abandoned by his own family could have disappeared in the statistics of the forgotten. It could have become just another bitter adult, bruised by abandonment, indifferent to the pain of others. But Charles Dickens did something that few get. He turned each tear into word, each humiliation in fuel, each lonely night in courage to continue. What was to kill him shaped him. In those months he lived alone, he discovered the power to observe. Instead of surrendering, he came to see every detail of the world around him. The rich who ignored the poor, the hungry children who walked the streets as shadows, the injustices accepted as routine. And all this has been accumulating in his heart as a silent gunpowder, ready to explode in the form of stories that would shake consciousness. Dickens learned early that pain has two ways, destroying or rebuilding. And he chose the second option, not for heroism, but out of necessity. Because I knew that if I let the suffering be overcome, it would be swallowed forever by darkness. Then, on every page he wrote, he deposited the childhood marks that the world tried to erase. In each character, he put a piece of the boy who survived, and so he began to rebuild not only himself but also the hope of those who read his words. This choice, to make pain a bridge instead of a wall, was his greatest act of courage. That's what a forgotten boy turned into a writer who would become the voice of the no one wanted to hear. And even after gaining fame, money, respect, the memory of the factory and the pension room was still alive. Not as an open wound, but as a scar that remembered where he had come from. A scar that did not embarrass him. On the contrary, I remembered him every day that his purpose was greater than the applause. Each time someone reads Dickens and feels less, it is the living proof that he has won, that the pain the world tried to use to destroy it became exactly what made it eternal. He did not write to erase his scars. He wrote to show that they can become strength, that they can even save. There was a day amid the grey routine of the factory and the overwhelming silence of the pension room where something changed inside Charles Dickens. A day when the pain didn't silence, pushed him. One day when, tired of just surviving, he made the most important choice of his life to fight. Not with shouts nor with violence, but with words, with dreams, with the certainty that even though he was just a poor and forgotten boy, he had something to say. Dickens realized that no one would come to save him, that the compassion I expected would not arrive from others, would need to be born of himself. And so he took the little flame that still burned in his chest and decided to write. Wrote as who breathes, like who clings to a board on the high seas, as if he understands in the back of his soul that if he did not transform his pain in a voice, he would be destroyed by silence. He began to observe everything more carefully, mentally registering the speeches of people, gestures, the injustices that witnessed on the streets. The humiliations he suffered himself served as a raw material. Every injustice, every tear, every moment of fear was kept, converted into a flame. Because for Dickens, writing was not a hobby. It was survival. It was to scream to the world that it existed, and that the other boys like it also existed. That day, the pain found direction. The anger found purpose. Silence found sound. And the boy who until then was just another emotional orphan began to lift his voice, still low but really loaded, a voice that years later would echo in the reading rooms, in theaters, homes of people who would never imagine how much that boy had caught to write. It was at this point that Dickens was no longer just a victim of the system. He became his opponent. He became the chronicler of the forgotten, the herald of the humiliated, the writer who did not fear exposing the rotten society that was proud of his morality, but destroyed the fragile in silence. The day he decided to fight had no trumpets or witnesses. It was not registered in the newspapers, nor celebrated in palaces, but it changed everything. And it proved that sometimes a single silent decision is enough to change the fate of those who seemed condemned to oblivion. Dickens chose to fight, and because of this, generations have learned that words can erect who the world tried to knock down. When Charles Dickens published his first tale, London still didn't know who he was. The text appeared in the newspapers, signed only as Boz, a pseudonym that no one could associate with anyone. For the city, it was just another story among many. But for the boy who grew up at the factory and was forgotten by the family, that moment was more than publication. It was the chance to exist. The tale exploded among the readers. People commented, cut the newspaper, read aloud in the cafes. For the first time, the city that ignored him began to hear his words. For the first time, the invisible boy felt that his voice had weight. And there, in those printed lines, the unexpected born, the author who would transform English literature forever. The strength of the text was not only in the skillful form in which Boz wrote, but in what he conveyed. Dickens knew how to look at the people who saw, capture their pains, their crazes, their joys and fears, and to return them to the reader with a sensitivity that wide the truth. His gaze revealed what society would rather hide. His soft but sharp mood dismantled the appearances. His silent compassion made it impossible to be indifferent. The publication was like a spark thrown into dry firewood. It lit the hope that Dickens had kept alive against all probabilities. He showed him that his lonely nights, his painful memories, his hunger days had not been in vain, that there was a reason for him to resist, and that by putting his pain into words, he could change not only his own life, but that of thousands who, like him, needed to be remembered that they existed. No one knew at that time that behind the pseudonym, Boz was a boy who had been left behind, a boy who stuck labels in grease jars, that cried alone in a pension room, but little by little this boy was starting to become giant. With each tale, with each character, with each sentence, Dickens proved that a well-told story can pierce the bubble of indifference and reach even the most distant hearts. In that first shy text, Dickens found that words are stronger than chains, but a voice is more powerful than fate, and that when someone invisible is finally heard, the whole world can change. When Charles Dickens began publishing his texts, he was not just telling stories, he was breaking the silence. A silence that had been imposed on him since he was a child, when he was set aside by his family, explored in factories, treated as one of so many invisible boys. His words then were not just beautiful, they were shouts contained, finally freed. Each phrase carried the echo of those who wanted to say to the world, "You forgot me, but I exist." And it was so, line by line, tale by tale, that Dickens began to shake consciousness. The Victorian London, proud of their appearances and hypocrisy, was shaking in the face of what he wrote. His texts were uncomfortable mirrors. They showed the hungry children, the widows with no future, the crushed workers. They wide opened the abyss between rich and poor. And there was no way to look away. His stories were so engaging that even those who did not want to think was confronted by the truth that emerged from each page. But Dickens did not write just to report. His words also offered hope. He reminded the forgotten that there was still someone who saw his pains, someone who not only saw, but cared, someone who placed the dignity of the little ones in the center of the narrative, as it had never been done. And that was revolutionary. This was transformative. In each tale, Dickens spoke of himself, but also millions who would never have a chance to be heard. His personal experience of pain gave his indignation authenticity. It was not theory, it was true. Truth lived on the skin, and so his words came where cold speeches would never come, in the heart, at the most vulnerable point of those who suffered in silence. Dickens discovered early on that words have power. What phrases can be broken chains? What paragraphs can open windows? And what stories can set asleep hearts on fire? He turned what was supposed to be just catharsis into collective strength, which was to be, "I'm sorry." What was to be weakness in courage. This is how he became a voice, not only his, but of those who were abandoned like him. And so he proved that writing is not just art, he is a weapon. It is bridge, it is healing. Because when a word is born of real pain, it does not end on paper. She crosses time and keeps saying, "I exist, and you too." The boy who one day stuck labels in grease pots, alone and forgotten in a pension room, began writing stories that crossed the dirty alley of London and reached the most luxurious halls in the country. Gradually, their tales were no longer read in small circles and were eagerly awaited throughout England. The pseudonym Boz revealed himself as Charles Dickens, and his name began to echo not only on the streets, but in the hearts. The newspapers fought to publish their texts. Families gathered to hear their stories read aloud. The plays based on their books crowded theaters. Suddenly, those who once despised him for being just another poor boy became his readers. Those who would have ignored him on a corner now proud to say that they bought their works. The invisible child became the man no one else dared to ignore. And so, what was born of humiliation flourished in honor. Each page he wrote was like a brick building a bridge between the abandonment of the past and the recognition of the present. His courage to expose injustices, his ability to thrill with simple and true words, his boldness to put the poor as protagonists of great stories, all made him more than an author, made him aware of a nation. Dickens's success did not come in comfort, came scratched in pain. It came with the bitter taste of fuel rejection. And that's why he was so unique, because his triumph was not just personal. It was a slap in the face of a system that said that those who are born poor must die invisible. It was a victory that inspired thousands to believe that its origin need not define its destiny. In a short time, the humiliated boy became the largest author in the country. The emotional orphan, abandoned even by his family, became the master of the curated and awakened words. The child worker that no one wanted to protect came to be protected by the love of crowds they found in their stories, comfort and courage. Dickens's success was more than literature. It was poetic justice. It was living proof that pain, when not accepted as a sentence, can be transformed into a path of light to themselves and everyone who still walks in the dark. Charles Dickens could have hidden everything. He could have erased from his narrative the humiliation of childhood, the miserable days at the factory, the loneliness nights in a pension room. It could have created for itself a comfortable biography, worthy of a famous author, full of triumphs and absent from falls. But he chose another way. He decided not to hide his scars. Dickens knew that the pain that had shaped him could be his greatest strength. He understood that the wound that bleeds today may be the mark that saves tomorrow, not just himself, but all who cross the same pains. Therefore, he turned his memories into fuel. In every orphan he described, there was an echo of the boy he went. In every denounced injustice, the cry he could not give as a child. In every silent victory of his characters, the hope he never allowed to die. By exposing the vulnerability of his protagonists, he also revealed his own. It showed that courage is not to hide what hurts, but walking despite the pain. What greatness is not to pretend in vulnerability, but to use the story itself, including the dark parts, to light on the paths of others. It was this choice that made him unforgettable. Because their stories did not sound false, they did not look moralistic or distant. They were real, human, intense. They spoke to those who already fell. They comforted those who already cried. They inspired who at the bottom of the well needed to believe that there was exit. Dickens understood what many spend their entire lives without realizing it, that hiding scars don't make them disappear, just makes them useless. But when exposed with courage, they become headlights. They say, "I survived, you can." And so their scars became their trademark, not as a sign of weakness, but as a living proof that it is possible to be injured and yet to write and live stories that transform the world. Charles Dickens's success did not happen overnight. Years of closed doors, frustrated attempts, nights in clear writing not knowing if anyone would read. They came moments of discouragement so deep that they almost made him stop. But what seemed delay was, in fact, preparation. And when the turn came, it arrived at the exact time, neither before nor after. That's when he most needed an answer, that the opportunity appeared. His first major text was published in a national newspaper, and his talent was recognized. The words he almost gave up on writing began running for England, playing rich and poor, young and old. That rejected boy, which many considered invisible, now had everyone's attention. The truth is that if success had come before, maybe he was not ready. Perhaps it had not turned pain into maturity. Perhaps I had not developed the empathy that marked every page you wrote. God, in his wisdom, allowed Dickens to be forged in silence and waiting until he was prepared to use his voice with purpose. Because when the right time arrived, Dickens doesn't shone. He changed the world around him. This is the lesson that his story leaves us. Failure does not have the last word. The pain does not define the outcome. And the apparent delay can only be the silent preparation for something larger. When everything seemed lost, when he was about to give up, hope showed that there were still ways, that there was still purpose, that there was still life. The turn did not come early, but it came perfectly. The exact moment Dickens was ready to carry the message that was not just his, but of all who suffer in silence, hoping that someone confirm that they still matter. And so Dickens's story reminds us, when you feel it is on the edge, God is still working, and the impossible can happen at the right time, because the last word never belongs to failure, it belongs to hope. When Charles Dickens wrote, he didn't just think about selling books. He thought of who was at the bottom of the well as he was already. He thought of those who worked long hours dreaming of something better, those who felt invisible, those who had been injured by whom he should protect. I thought of every heart tired of trying, and that's why every page that has come out of its sentence carries a powerful reminder to this day. Failure does not define the end. Dickens knew that many readers would live what he lived. The pain of being ignored, the fear of never being sufficient, the anguish of seeing the days pass without hope. He knew that for many, shame and humiliation became so heavy that giving up seemed the only way out. And that's why he chose to use his words as bridges, not just as entertainment. In their stories, the little ones triumph, the weak resist, the despised find dignity, not by chance, but because Dickens wanted to prove in every plot that hope is not naivete, it is survival. That pain doesn't have to be sentence. It can be a seed of a new beginning, and that even when everything seems lost, life can still surprise with twists that no tired heart expects. He wrote so that you today don't give up, to understand that your story does not need to end where the pain began, that there is hidden force in you, the same force that made a factory boy become the most read author of the 19th century, and that the impossible you fear so much may be precisely what awaits you if you continue. Dickens is living proof that victory doesn't always come fast, but it comes. That what matters is not how many times you have fallen, but how many times have you chosen to get up, and that who has been humiliated, when it decides not to give up, can be honored in a way that no one imagines. So every time the defeat whisper that you will not make, remember, he won when it all said no, and you can. Charles Dickens' story is not just exciting, it is scandalously unlikely. A forgotten boy, trapped in a cycle of misery, working hours in an unhealthy factory, abandoned even by his own family. No one would look at him and say, there will be born a genius. But it was exactly that hard flaw that something the world would never forget. And that's why his story is the greatest proof that the unexpected exists. Dickens shows us that the impossible is not fantasy. It is reality for those who do not give up. He left the darkest anonymity to become the voice of the oppressed, transformed humiliation into fuel. He made his own tears raw materials for stories that still inspire millions today. The ignored boy became the man who put in words the pains no one dared to say. The exploited, invisible employee became one of the most beloved authors on the planet, remembered as who revolutionized literature and shook the elite's consciences. Your trajectory remembers that in one day everything can start to change, that in an unexpected meeting, in an almost unlikely chance, in a yes after so many no, fate can turn. Not because the world is fair, but because God specializes in twists that challenge logic. And that's what Dickens lived. When everything seemed sealed by failure, a door opened, and he entered with her with courage, giving to the world the voice he carried in silence for so long. The beauty of its history is to show that pain can be fertile soil for miracles, that those who resist a little more see horizons than those who stop ever summer, that the unlikely can happen, and happen so surprisingly that no one would dare to imagine. So today, when remembering Dickens, don't just think about the famous author. Think of the forgotten boy who became giant. And remember, the unexpected exists, and as long as you continue, it can change everything in one day. The time has come to transform everything you heard in this story into a decision, in attitude, in statement, because life is not just made of falls, but the choices I make after them. Charles Dickens has shown us that even the darker pages can become the prologue of something bigger if you don't give up. And today it's time for you to declare with faith and courage, I believe in restarts. Say aloud, or say in the silence of your heart. But say, because when everything seems lost, when defeat seems inevitable, that's where God reveals that there are still blank pages waiting for you, that the story does not end in the chapter of pain, that dreams do not die with the no you received, and that hope is more powerful than any failure. Dickens is the living proof that restarts exist, that humiliation need not be the last word, that shame can be exchanged for honor, that those who feel invisible today may be the voice that inspires multitudes tomorrow. And if that was possible for him, why wouldn't it be for you? Today, it refuses to believe that it all is over. Choose, see beyond what your eyes reach. Believe that even without signs, even without guarantees, there is still a way. Because starting over is not weakness. It is courage. It is faith. It is deciding that your story will not stop at the hardest time. Declare with all the strength that still remains, I believe in restarts, because whoever believes continues, and whoever goes on finds out that the impossible can happen at the right time, with purpose, with love, with God's hand guiding every step. Today, allow your story to be rewritten too, because the beginning you need may be closer than you think. If Dickens, who has been humiliated, rejected and forgotten, managed to see the impossible happen, you can. Don't give up before the unexpected, because the turn you expect may be closer than you think. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell here. Each story is a seed of hope for those who think everything is lost.